Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking into the case of Monroe Betterton.
And it's a fascinating case. When you look at the early 1900s in America, the justice system, it was a different world back then.
Oh, absolutely. It's really going to make you question everything you thought you knew about the American justice system back then. We're
Right.
talking like 100 years ago. So,
Right. And in this case really brings up some really you know, some dark realities.
yeah. So we're going to be using his Wikipedia article as a jumping off point.
Uh-huh.
There's probably some faded newspaper clippings out there somewhere too, but
Oh, I bet there
we're
are.
going to try to figure out not just what happened, but
Yeah.
why it matters to us now.
Yeah, the big question is what can we learn from this?
So let's set the scene. Okay, it's 1917. And this guy is granted parole after only serving 10 years of a 99-year sentence.
Wait, so he was convicted of murder and
Oh.
wow, and he only served 10 years.
That's Monroe Betterton.
That's unbelievable. I mean, what was the parole system like back then?
Well, that's part of what makes this case so interesting. We're not just looking at one man's crimes, we're looking at a whole system,
An entire society.
grappling with issues that are still relevant today.
Yeah.
And to really understand it all, we got to go back to the beginning.
Okay, so back to the very beginning.
So Betterton, he was born in 1872 in Missouri, one of 15 children, grew up on a farm. Pretty ordinary start, right?
In small town America, yeah.
Marries Laura, Elizabeth McCoy, starts a family, almost like a picture of rural American life.
It's like that classic tale, right? Like you see this idyllic picture and then
But then it all goes wrong.
it all goes south.
Things went sour between Bitterton and Laura, arguments, tension. And then in 1904, he beat her so badly that she died from her injuries.
Oh my God.
And get this, he was never charged with her death.
Are you serious?
I know, can you imagine that happening today?
No, it's inconceivable. I mean, a man beats his wife to death and just walks free.
It's crazy. It really says something about the way domestic violence was viewed back then.
Yeah, it was like a private matter or something.
Like something you just didn't talk about.
Exactly, hush hush.
So Bitterton, he just moved on. He hired a Choctaw woman named Rose Hudson as a housekeeper.
Oh boy. This is not going to end well, is it?
No, it's not. In this relationship, it also became violent.
Of course it did. It's like a pattern.
Constant turmoil, separations,
Hmm.
reconciliation. It was a mess.
Hmm.
Then in December 1906, Hudson, she decides to leave Betterton.
Good for her.
But he convinces her to take one last trip with him to Verona to see his kids who are living with their grandfather.
Oh no, I don't like where this is going.
They board a train for the return journey, and Betterton, fueled by whiskey, starts another fight with Hudson.
Oh, this is bad news.
Can you picture the tension on that train?
Oh, I can only imagine. Like a powder keg?
The train makes an unscheduled stop near Monet. They get off and they're walking towards town, and the argument just explodes.
Oh.
Betterton stabs Hudson 3 times.
Oh my God.
And this is the really messed up part. He pours whiskey on her dying face.
That's just cruel. Why
Yeah.
would he do that?
I don't know. It's a horrifying detail. But thankfully, a nearby train crew saw what happened. They apprehended Betterton, and this time he was sentenced to 99 years in prison for Hudson's murder.
99 years, finally some justice.
Right. It seemed like he was finally going to be held accountable for his actions.
Hmm.
But that's not the end of the story.
What do you mean? There's more.
Oh, yeah. Just 10 years later, Betterton was granted parole.
What? How is that even possible?
I know, it's crazy, right? A 99-year sentence reduced to a mere decade.
This is insane.
It just goes to show you that the justice system, even back then, well, it wasn't perfect.
Understatement of the century.
And in Betterton's case, this early release, it had devastating consequences.
Devastating.
Yeah, and we're going to pick up that thread in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait to hear what happened next. This is just unbelievable. So Betterton gets out after just 10 years.
Yeah, 1917, he's a free man. And remember, this is a guy who was sentenced to 99 years for murder.
It just boggles the mind. What were they thinking?
I mean, did they think he was rehabilitated?
I guess so, but I mean, how could you possibly know for sure?
Well, we can't really get into the heads of those parole board members, but we could look at the context.
The historical context.
Well, like, think about it. Prisons back then were probably pretty overcrowded.
Right. And I bet they didn't have a lot of resources for rehabilitation programs or anything like that.
Plus, there might have been public pressure to release some inmates.
Maybe some people were advocating for shorter sentences in general.
It's possible.
Mm-hmm.
And, back then, things were a lot less transparent.
Yeah, who knows what kind of political influence or personal connections were at play.
We might never know the full story behind Betterton's parole.
But we do know what happened next.
And It's not good.
It's tragic, really.
So Betterton goes back to Monet, and he meets this woman, Elzada Lockwood.
And they get married.
Yep, June 1918.
So he's trying to build a new life for himself.
It seems that way. On the surface, at least.
Right, like was he genuinely trying to change, or was it all just an act?
It's hard to say.
Hmm.
We're talking about a guy who's already killed 2 people.
Yeah, and then there's that whole thing with the house fire.
Oh, yeah, just a few months after the wedding, their house burns down.
Was anyone hurt?
No, it was officially ruled an accident, but...
It makes you wonder.
Right, like, was it really an accident, or was there something more sinister going on?
I mean, we're talking about Monroe Betterton here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's that whole double wedding situation.
Double wedding.
Yeah, so July 1st, 1918, Betterton and Lockwood decide to remarry
Okay.
on the same day as Lockwood's daughter and Betterton's son's wedding.
Wait, so a double wedding with their kids.
Yep, pretty weird, right?
That's I mean, was he trying to create this, like, spectacle?
Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it certainly adds another layer of weirdness to this whole story.
It definitely doesn't scream healthy relationship.
And sadly, the events that unfolded the following year just confirmed those suspicions.
So what happened?
July 1919, the newly blended family, they all decided to go on a trip to Veneta, Oklahoma.
To celebrate their new beginnings?
Yeah, something like that.
Eh.
And that's where things take a very dark turn.
What happened in Veneta?
While the younger couple was away, an argument breaks out between Betterton and Lockwood.
Another argument. Oh, I've heard this one before.
And this time it ends fatally.
He killed her, didn't he?
Yeah, he shot her 3 times.
Oh, my God. This is just awful.
His own son, Ernest, he witnessed the whole thing.
He saw his father kill his stepmother.
Yeah, and he actually wrestled the gun away from Betterton to stop him from shooting anyone else.
Wow. That's incredible. I can't imagine what that must have been like for him.
It's a horrific thought.
Uh,
But, it just goes to show you how violence can ripple outwards.
It affects everyone involved.
Yeah. So when the neighbors arrived, Betterton tried to blame Ernest for the shooting.
He tried to frame his own son.
Yep. But thankfully, no one believed him. I mean, the guy had already killed 2 women.
Right. There was a clear pattern of violence.
So he was arrested. And while he was awaiting trial, he made this chilling statement.
What did he say?
He threatened to kill himself and his entire family if he was ever released.
Wow, that's intense. Was he serious?
It's hard to say. Was it a genuine threat, or was he just trying to manipulate this situation?
I mean, it could be either, right?
Yeah, it's a question that psychologists and criminologists are still trying to figure out what drives people to commit these kinds of acts.
Like, is it nature versus nurture? Is it mental illness?
Is it a choice?
Uh,
We may never have all the answers.
but it's a question worth asking.
So here we have Monroe Betterton, a man who has now killed 2 women he was involved with.
And yet he still maintained his innocence throughout his trial.
Yep, even with all the evidence stacked against him.
That's crazy. I mean, how can you deny something like that?
Well, it's a common thing we see with these types of criminals.
Like a psychological defense mechanism?
Maybe. Or maybe it's a cold, calculated strategy to try and sway the jury.
Who knows what's going on in their heads?
But either way, it's a testament to the complexity of the human psyche.
Right, like how can someone do these horrific things and still believe they're innocent?
It's a mystery. So his trial began in July of 1919.
And his own children testified against him.
Yep. They recounted the horrors they had witnessed.
Wow, that must have been so difficult for them.
I can't imagine.
But they were brave to speak out.
We were.
So what was the verdict?
Guilty.
And he was sentenced to death.
Yep. It seemed like the justice system was silently catching up to him.
After all those years,
But even in the face of his execution, Betterton clung to his claims of innocence.
he never admitted to anything.
Nope. He was granted a stay for a mental evaluation.
So they wanted to make sure he was competent to stand trial.
Yeah. But the evaluation determined that he was sane and fully aware of his actions.
So there was no escaping his fate.
No. And on July 9th, 1920, exactly 1 year after murdering Elzada Lockwood, Monroe Betterton was executed in the electric chair.
Wow. What were his last words?
Reportedly, he said goodbye and God bless you all.
That's so strange. It's like he was at peace with it all.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, did he finally accept responsibility for his actions, or was it all just another performance?
We'll never know for sure.
So now that we've reached the end of his story, what do we do with it?
That's the big question. What is Monroe Betterton's legacy?
And what can we learn from his life of violence?
So we've gone through a lot with this deep dive, really dug into the dark life of Monroe Betterton. And, he definitely left a lot of pain behind. But now we got to figure out what it all means. Like, what's the lasting impact of a story like this?
Right. It's not just about the facts and dates, It's about trying to make sense of a life filled with violence and, well, how that reflects on us today.
Yeah, it'd be easy to just dismiss Betterton as a monster from the past, but
Oh, but we can't do that, can we?
no, we can't. I mean, that wouldn't be fair to his victims, to their families, and really to ourselves.
Exactly, because even though the world's changed a lot since Betterton's time, the roots of violence are still there. You know what I mean?
I do, I do. And his story, it reminds us that we can't just assume we've moved past all that.
Yeah. Complacency is dangerous.
Exactly. Think about it back then, domestic violence, it wasn't even really considered a crime, you know?
Oh, yeah. It was like a family matter.
Right, the cops didn't want to get involved and society just kind of looked the other way.
It's crazy to think that someone could literally beat their wife to death and get away with it.
It is, and that's what happened with Betterton's first wife, Laura. He was never held accountable for her death.
And that allowed the cycle of violence to continue.
Exactly. And then there's the whole parole system back then.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other can of worms.
It's mind-boggling that someone convicted of murder could be released after only 10 years.
I know. It makes you question the whole system.
Right. Was it overcrowding? Was it political pressure? Was it just plain incompetence?
Who knows? But it's a reminder that justice isn't always served.
But Betterton's story isn't just about the failures of the past. It's also about how far we've come.
Right. We've made progress.
Today, domestic violence is recognized as a serious crime.
We have laws to protect victims.
Support systems, shelters, hotlines.
We've come a long way, baby.
We have. But let's be real. We still have a long way to go.
Oh, absolutely. Domestic violence is still a huge problem.
And it's not just physical violence either.
Right. It's emotional abuse. It's psychological manipulation. It's financial control.
It's about power and control.
And Betterton's story, it shows us just how insidious that can be.
All those patterns of control, the manipulation, the escalating violence.
It's a classic case study in abuse.
And we need to be able to recognize those signs, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of people around us.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of the red flags.
We got to challenge those old-fashioned ideas that silence victims and protect abusers.
We need to create a culture where violence is never okay.
Where everyone feels safe and respected.
Exactly.
So Betterton's legacy, it might be a dark one, but it can also help us move forward.
It can show us what not to do.
We can learn from the mistakes of the past and try to build a better future.
A future where stories like his are less and less common.
So that's the story of Monroe Betterton, a man who committed terrible acts, but whose life can teach us valuable lessons.
And even though we've reached the end of this deep dive, the conversation doesn't stop here.
No, it doesn't. There's always more to learn, more to uncover.
Especially with a case like this.
We just scratched the surface with his Wikipedia entry.
Imagine all the untold stories out there.
Yeah, and those old newspapers, those court documents.
The voices of the people who knew him.
The people who loved him, the people who feared him.
It's a reminder that history is more than just dates and facts. It's about people and their lives.
And their stories.
Yeah.
And we owe it to ourselves to keep searching for those stories, to keep learning from them.
To keep the conversation going.
Because the past isn't just something we study, it's something we carry with us.
It shapes who we are.
And who we choose to be.
So let's choose to be better.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.